The children noticed something was wrong before any of the adults did. Every weekday for more than 15 years, the same elderly man had stood in the middle of Maple Avenue before sunrise, lifting a bright orange stop sign with one hand while greeting every child by name with the other. On that Monday morning, his reflective vest still hung neatly on the wooden hook beside the school entrance. His folding chair remained exactly where he always left it. But the man who never missed a single morning was nowhere to be seen. Parents exchanged worried glances, teachers whispered to one another, and dozens of children kept looking toward the corner, waiting for the familiar smile that never appeared. None of us understood why Harold Bennett had suddenly disappeared, and none of us realized the most important story he had never told was about to become our responsibility. If you have ever wondered whether one quiet life can shape hundreds of others, stay with me for a little while. By the time I became a fifth-grade teacher at Jefferson Elementary, Mr. Bennett had already become the part of the neighborhood itself. I had first met him when I was 6 years old, nervous about crossing Maple Avenue on my very first day of school. He had knelt until we were eye level, smiled beneath his weathered army cap, and said, "Good morning, Lucas Reed. Your mother says you're brave enough to cross with me today." I never forgot that he knew my name before I introduced myself. He knew everyone's name, not only the children currently attending school, but older brothers, younger sisters, and sometimes even parents who had once crossed the same street holding his hand decades earlier. New families often assumed he carried an official roster. He never did. He simply remembered people because, in his words, children deserved to know somebody noticed they arrived safely. That Monday afternoon, Principal Emily Carter gathered the staff in the library. "I just spoke with St. Mary's Hospital," she said quietly. "Harold suffered a cardiac emergency yesterday evening." Silence settled over the room. "Is he going to be all right?" someone asked. "The doctors believe he'll recover, but they don't expect him to return to the crossing anytime soon." The words felt heavier than they should have. We weren't talking about replacing a crossing guard. We were talking about replacing part of the rhythm that had quietly held our community together for years. School dismissed later that afternoon under the supervision of a temporary officer unfamiliar with the children. Cars hesitated. Parents called out directions. Several younger students looked frightened crossing without the calm voice they trusted every morning. As I watched the confusion unfold, one little girl tugged gently on my sleeve. "Mr. Reed?" "Yes, Sophie?" "When Mr. Bennett comes back, can you tell him I remembered to wave even though he wasn't here?" I smiled, though it was harder than I expected. "I promise." She nodded happily before running toward her mother. Only after she disappeared did I realize something painful. Harold had spent 15 years making sure every child felt remembered, yet almost none of us knew anything about the man who remembered us. That evening, I drove to the hospital, carrying nothing more than a simple greeting card signed by my students. I expected to spend 5 quiet minutes at his bedside. Instead, when I stepped into the waiting room, I found more than 30 former students already standing there, each holding flowers, handwritten letters, or small drawings from lives Harold had quietly touched. And among them sat a battered little notebook with hundreds of children's names written carefully inside, opened to one blank page that no one yet understood. The waiting room outside Harold Bennett's hospital room became unexpectedly crowded before sunset. Parents arrived carrying flowers. Teenagers hurried in wearing college sweatshirts. Young adults came straight from work still dressed in uniforms, business suits, and construction boots. Some had not seen one another in years, yet every conversation began the same way. "Do you remember how he always said your name before you even reached the corner?" No one remembered him simply as the crossing guard. Everyone remembered how he made them feel. Principal Emily Carter quietly placed a folding table near the entrance with several blank sheets of paper. "If you'd like," she said, "write down one memory of Harold. His family has always been very private. Maybe together we can give him something to read when he wakes up." Within minutes, the pages began filling. One former student remembered Harold waiting 20 extra minutes in freezing rain because a frightened first grader refused to cross without holding his hand. Another recalled how Harold somehow noticed she had forgotten her lunch 3 days in a row and quietly arranged for the cafeteria staff to have an extra meal ready before anyone else realized her family was struggling. None of us had known those stories before. Each memory uncovered another. As I read through the growing stack of handwritten notes, I realized something remarkable. Almost every story described a small act that seemed insignificant by itself. Yet taken together, they formed the outline of a man who had quietly watched over an entire generation without expecting anyone to notice. The following afternoon, Harold opened his eyes for the first time. Doctors were encouraged, but firm. "No unnecessary excitement," they warned. "His heart needs time." Emily and I were allowed only a brief visit. Harold looked smaller than I had ever seen him, though the gentle smile that greeted us remained unchanged. "I suppose someone else had to stop traffic today," he joked. Emily laughed softly. "They managed." He nodded with obvious relief. "Good." "Not. How am I?" "Not." "What happened?" His first concern was whether the children had crossed safely. Before leaving, I handed him the greeting card signed by my students. He turned every page carefully, reading each child's name aloud as though he were taking attendance. When he reached the final signature, he closed the card and whispered, "Nobody should grow up believing they were forgotten." The sentence stayed with me long after we left the room. Outside, Emily stopped walking. "Lucas?" "Yes?" "Did you notice something strange?" I had. There wasn't a single photograph beside his bed. No family pictures. No military photos. No awards. Nothing. Only one worn notebook rested on the bedside table, the same notebook we had seen in the waiting room. Later that evening, Harold's longtime neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Watkins, arrived carrying a small cardboard box. "I thought he might want these," she explained. Inside were neatly bundled birthday cards the neighborhood children had made for him over the years. Beneath them rested dozens of tiny handmade ornaments, friendship bracelets, and crayon drawings that Harold had carefully saved instead of throwing away. At the bottom of the box lay another notebook. Unlike the first one, this one was much older. Its cover had nearly worn smooth. Across the front, written in faded black ink, were only 4 simple words. "Names matter more than medals." Emily looked at me in silence. Neither of us had ever heard Harold say those words. When we opened the notebook, we expected attendance records or daily schedules. Instead, the first page contained a date from nearly 40 years earlier, followed by a sentence written in Harold's careful handwriting. "I promised myself that if I could never save every child, I would never let another one feel invisible." Neither of us understood what tragedy had inspired that promise. But for the first time, we knew Harold's quiet kindness had begun long before he ever stood at that crosswalk. And somewhere inside those aging pages, the story he had never told was waiting for us. The old notebook stayed with me long after I left the hospital that evening. I had planned to spend the night grading papers, yet I found myself reading and rereading Harold's single sentence instead. If I could never save every child, I would never let another one feel invisible. It was too personal to be a slogan, and too painful to be an ordinary memory. Somewhere behind those words was the story Harold had spent decades refusing to tell. The following morning, Principal Emily Carter met me outside the hospital, carrying a canvas bag filled with neatly organized folders. "I called the school district archives," she explained. "They've kept records from Harold's volunteer years. You think we'll find answers? I think we'll find where to start." Harold was awake when we entered, though he looked exhausted. The monitor beside his bed rose and fell with a slow, steady rhythm. He smiled when he saw us, but his eyes drifted immediately toward the school playground, visible through the hospital window. "Busy morning?" he asked. Emily nodded. "The new crossing officer is learning. I hope the little ones aren't frightened. They're doing their best." He relaxed slightly. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things: weather, school projects, the upcoming spring concert. It became obvious that Harold preferred discussing everyone else's lives instead of his own. Before leaving, I placed the old notebook on his bedside table. "I think this belongs to you." He rested his hand on the worn cover, but did not open it. I wondered where Eleanor had hidden that. "You never mentioned it. I never thought anyone would read it." His answer was gentle, yet final. As we turned toward the door, he spoke again. "Lucas." "Yes, sir?" "Whatever you think that notebook says, don't let it make me sound like something I'm not." "What are you?" He smiled faintly. "A man who kept showing up. Nothing more. Nothing less." Outside the room, Emily looked at me thoughtfully. "He's protecting someone." "You think so?" "He isn't protecting himself." That possibility changed the way I looked at every page. Later that afternoon, we visited the district archive housed in the basement of the old administration building. Most volunteer files contained only schedules and annual evaluations. Harold's file was unusually thin. One page listed his military service: retired United States Army, logistics, 24 years, excellent record, no decorations beyond routine commendations, nothing extraordinary. At first, it felt disappointing. Then Emily noticed a handwritten note clipped to the back. "Volunteer application approved immediately upon recommendation of Officer Daniel Morris." "Who's Daniel Morris?" I asked. The archivist smiled. "The retired police captain. He still lives here. Every Tuesday morning he plays chess at the Veterans Center." Within an hour we were sitting across from Captain Morris, now in his 80s, studying the same notebook that had started our search. The old captain laughed softly when Harold's name appeared. "That stubborn fellow. You know him well?" I asked. "I've known him for almost 30 years. Why did you recommend him?" The smile slowly disappeared. "Because I'd already watched him save this town in ways nobody ever counted." Emily leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Captain Morris hesitated, as though measuring each memory before speaking. When Harold applied to become a crossing guard, he gave me one condition. What was it? He said he never wanted anyone introducing him as a veteran. I frowned. Why? Because he believed children shouldn't respect him for what he did decades earlier. The captain looked out the window before finishing. They should trust him because he showed up today. Silence settled between us. Then Captain Morris opened a drawer beside his chessboard and removed an old newspaper clipping. The headline wasn't about military service. It described a tragic traffic accident outside Jefferson Elementary nearly 40 years earlier. One child had not survived. The article mentioned a young Army sergeant named Harold Bennett, who had been among the first people to reach the scene. Captain Morris carefully folded the paper again. That morning changed the rest of his life. I stared at the clipping. For years, we had believed Harold remembered every child's name because he possessed an extraordinary memory. Now another possibility emerged. Perhaps he remembered every name because there had once been one child whose name he believed he had learned too late. The newspaper clipping stayed folded in my jacket pocket for 2 days before I found the courage to read it again. I kept hoping that a second look would reveal some detail proving Captain Morris had misunderstood the past. Instead, every sentence deepened the mystery. The article described a rainy October morning, a speeding delivery truck that failed to stop, and a young Army sergeant named Harold Bennett who rushed into traffic to help frightened children. The tragedy had claimed the life of one second-grade student before emergency crews could arrive. Harold had not caused the accident. He had done everything anyone could have done. Yet somehow, he carried its weight for the next 40 years. When Emily and I returned to the hospital, Harold was sitting upright for the first time, slowly working through a physical therapy exercise. He smiled when he saw us, but his expression changed the moment he noticed the folded newspaper in my hand. "So," he said quietly, "you found Daniel." "We did." "He talks too much." Emily smiled gently. "He talks because he respects you." Harold looked out the window instead of answering. I finally asked the question that had been waiting between us. "Was the article true?" He nodded once. "Every word. You tried to save that little boy." "I tried." "You couldn't." "No." The room became silent, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. After several moments, Harold spoke again. "People always tell me I shouldn't blame myself. Do you?" He considered the question carefully. "No." "Then why have you spent 40 years carrying this?" His eyes remained fixed on the window overlooking Jefferson Elementary. "Because I learned something that morning." He paused. "I never learned the boy's name." Emily frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" There was so much confusion. Ambulances, police, parents screaming. He swallowed hard. By the time I heard someone say his name, it was already too late. I felt my throat tighten. The next morning, I wrote one sentence in that notebook. He looked toward the worn journal resting on the bedside table. If I could never save every child, I would never let another one feel invisible. For the first time, the mystery no longer centered on military service or hidden heroics. It centered on a promise born from regret. Before either of us could respond, a nurse entered with discharge paperwork. Harold would be transferred to a rehabilitation center the following morning. "The doctors recommend permanent retirement," she explained kindly. Harold simply nodded. He did not argue. He did not complain. But after the nurse left, I watched him glance instinctively toward the school crosswalk again. His heart understood what his body no longer could. That evening, Emily suggested we continue gathering memories from former students before Harold left the hospital. What began as a handful of letters quickly became something much larger. Teachers opened old yearbooks. Parents searched through family photo albums. Former students mailed handwritten stories from other states. A firefighter described how Harold had convinced him, as a frightened first grader, that courage often looked like taking one careful step at a time. A pediatric nurse remembered Harold quietly waiting with her every morning after her father died because he knew she hated walking into school alone. A city engineer admitted he had chosen public service because one crossing guard had taught him that protecting strangers could become an ordinary way of life. Each memory answered one question while creating another. How many lives had Harold quietly changed without ever realizing it? Then Emily uncovered something none of us expected. Inside an old school newsletter from nearly 20 years earlier was a tiny group photograph of volunteers standing beside the crosswalk. Most people smiled toward the camera. Harold wasn't looking at the photographer. He was looking across the street at a little boy standing alone with untied shoes, making sure he crossed safely before anyone took the picture. The photograph captured the truth more clearly than any speech ever could. Even when recognition finally came looking for Harold Bennett, his attention had remained exactly where it always belonged: on the child who needed him. And as I turned the faded photograph over, I noticed a handwritten note on the back that neither Emily nor I recognized. It contained only one name, the same name as the boy who had died 40 years earlier. I turned the faded photograph over again, convinced my eyes had misunderstood what they had seen. Written in Harold's careful handwriting, across the yellowed back, were only 3 words: "Never forget Michael." For a long moment, neither Emily nor I spoke. The little boy who had died outside Jefferson Elementary nearly 40 years earlier finally had a name: Michael Turner. Harold had carried it with him every single day, not as a punishment, as a promise. The next morning, we visited the rehabilitation center before school began. Harold looked stronger than he had only 2 days earlier, but the determination that had always defined him seemed quieter now. Physical therapy had exhausted him. Yet when Emily showed him the old photograph, his fingers trembled ever so slightly. "You found that," he whispered. "We found Michael's name." He closed his eyes. I hoped someone eventually would. I pulled a chair beside his bed. "Harold, why didn't you ever tell anyone?" He took a slow breath before answering. "Because the story was never supposed to be about me. It already is." "No." His voice remained gentle but firm. "It should always be about the children." He reached toward the notebook resting beside him. "I wasn't the one who was lost that morning." He opened to a page written years after the accident. "Michael's mother once told me something I could never forget." His tired fingers stopped on a single sentence. "Please don't spend your life remembering only my son. Help every other child get home." The room fell completely silent. Everything changed. For 40 years, we had assumed Harold crossed children safely because he couldn't forgive himself. The truth was far more powerful. He continued because a grieving mother had transformed unbearable loss into a mission of hope. Emily quietly wiped away a tear. So every morning, Harold smiled faintly. I kept my promise. No medals, no ceremonies, just one ordinary morning after another. That afternoon, news spread quickly through Maple Hollow that Harold would never return as the school's crossing guard. The doctor's decision was final. Parents began organizing a retirement reception, but something about the plans felt incomplete. Balloons, banners, and speeches could never explain what we had finally begun to understand. Then the phone started ringing. Former students called from neighboring towns. Teachers shared forgotten classroom stories. A firefighter mailed copies of letters Harold had written recommending him for a youth leadership scholarship. A nurse revealed that Harold had quietly visited pediatric patients every Christmas Eve for nearly 12 years after finishing his crossing shift. A local mechanic admitted Harold had anonymously paid for repairs so single parents could continue driving their children to school. None of those acts had appeared in newspapers. None had been mentioned by Harold himself. Each discovery made one thing painfully clear. The crosswalk had only been the place where people saw him. His quiet service had stretched far beyond it. By evening, volunteers filled the school library, sorting hundreds of memories into binders. Children decorated handmade thank you cards. Retired teachers searched old filing cabinets. Parents assembled photographs from decades of school events. The tribute was becoming something much larger than a retirement celebration. It was becoming the written history of a man who had spent his entire life making sure other people were remembered while asking nothing in return. Late that night, I returned alone to the rehabilitation center. Harold was awake. The notebook rested closed on his lap. I heard what everyone's doing, he said softly. They love you. He smiled. I hope they love each other more. You really don't want recognition, do you? He looked toward the dark hospital window. I've already received it. I frowned. When? Every morning a child crossed the street smiling instead of afraid. His answer left me with nothing more to say. As I stood to leave, Harold handed me the notebook. I think it's time. For what? For someone else to finish the last page. I opened it carefully. Every page was filled with names. Every page except one. The final blank page. And for the first time I realized it had never been left empty by accident. Harold had been saving it for the generation whose lives had been changed by his quiet promise. The notebook felt heavier than its worn leather cover should have allowed. As I carried it home that evening, I realized Harold had not simply entrusted me with blank paper. He had entrusted me with the final chapter of a promise that had begun 40 years earlier with a grieving mother's request. Every page before the last contained names written in the same careful handwriting, each accompanied by a date and one brief observation. None praised achievements or listed grades. Harold had written only the moments that revealed character. Shared his umbrella. Helped her younger brother. Returned a lost wallet. Apologized without being asked. The notebook was never a record of perfect children. It was a record of growing hearts. The following morning, Emily and I began reading selected entries to former students who had gathered at the school library. Many laughed through tears as they recognized themselves. I can't believe he remembered that, one woman whispered after hearing the note Harold had written about her lending a winter coat to a classmate 22 years earlier. A retired firefighter smiled when Emily read, "Ran back because another child was afraid." That was the day I decided I wanted to help people, he admitted quietly. The room gradually changed. People had arrived believing they were collecting memories to comfort Harold. Instead, they were discovering that Harold had quietly remembered the best version of each of them long before they learned to see it themselves. Late that afternoon, we met with the school board to discuss a community tribute. Their first proposal was well-intentioned: a bronze statue near the crosswalk. Another member suggested renaming the intersection. Someone else recommended an annual ceremony. Each idea sounded respectful. None felt like Harold. "He'll refuse every one of those," Emily said gently. The superintendent looked puzzled. "Then what do we do?" I opened the notebook to its final empty page. "We finish what he started." Silence followed. "What does that mean?" one board member asked. "It means we stop celebrating Harold for one afternoon and start protecting children for the next 40 years. The room slowly grew thoughtful. Instead of a monument, Emily proposed creating a volunteer crossing program where retired neighbors would receive training to assist schools throughout the district. Each volunteer would learn every child's name, not because policy required it, because Harold believed names mattered. The idea spread through the room almost immediately. Teachers offered to coordinate schedules. Parents volunteered. Several retired veterans quietly raised their hands. For the first time since Harold's illness, hope felt stronger than fear. That evening, I visited the rehabilitation center to tell him about the meeting. He listened patiently without interrupting. When I finished, he smiled in the same modest way he always had. "That's much better than a statue. I thought you'd say that." He nodded toward the notebook resting on my lap. "Have you written anything yet?" "No." "Why not?" "I don't know whose name belongs there." Harold looked out the window where children were leaving a nearby playground. "You're asking the wrong question." "I am?" "The last page isn't waiting for one name." I frowned. "It never was." He reached for the notebook, turned to the blank page, and gently tapped the empty paper with one finger. "I left it empty because every generation gets another chance. Another chance to notice someone. Another chance to protect someone. Another chance to remember someone who might otherwise feel invisible." His breathing grew slower as exhaustion settled over him. Before I left, he spoke one final sentence. "Promise me you won't fill that page too quickly." "I promise." Because for the first time I understood what Harold had really been preserving. Not an unfinished list. An unfinished responsibility. The next morning, the community announced the volunteer program. Within hours, more than 80 people signed up. Parents, retired teachers, former students, veterans, neighbors. The response should have felt like a victory. Instead, the doctors called Emily with unexpected news. Harold's heart had become dangerously unstable overnight. They could not promise he would be strong enough to attend the community gathering planned for the end of the week. The tribute we had spent days preparing might arrive too late for the man who inspired it, and the final blank page of his notebook remained unwritten, waiting for a generation that suddenly feared it might lose the chance to thank him in person. The morning of the community gathering arrived beneath a sky so clear it almost felt unfair. After days of rain, The sidewalks outside Jefferson Elementary were dry again, and volunteers wearing bright reflective vests quietly assembled near the familiar crosswalk. Some were retired teachers. Others were former firefighters, veterans, parents, and grandparents. Every one of them had completed the new training program inspired by Harold's life. Before anyone spoke, each volunteer stood silently for a moment at the curb, watching children cross exactly as Harold had done thousands of times before. Yet one question overshadowed everything. Would Harold be well enough to come? Just after 9 o'clock, Emily received a phone call from the rehabilitation center. She listened without interrupting, then slowly smiled through tears. He's on his way. A wave of relief passed through the crowd. No cheering, no applause, only quiet gratitude. About 20 minutes later, a small medical transport van pulled carefully into the school parking lot. Harold stepped out slowly with the assistance of a physical therapist, leaning on a cane he clearly disliked using. His movements were slower than any of us had ever seen, but his eyes searched instinctively toward the crosswalk before noticing the people gathered there. He froze. Not because of the crowd, because every volunteer standing at the curb wore a name badge, not with their own names. Each badge displayed the name of one child they had promised to learn personally before the school year ended. Harold looked at Emily. "You did that?" She shook her head. They did. Former students began stepping forward one at a time. The firefighter Harold had encouraged as a frightened first grader thanked him for teaching courage without ever mentioning bravery. The pediatric nurse spoke about the mornings Harold waited with her after her father's death until she could smile again. A city engineer admitted that every safe intersection he designed carried a quiet memory of one crossing guard who believed strangers deserved protection. None of them praised Harold's military service. None mentioned medals. They spoke only about the ordinary mornings that had quietly redirected extraordinary lives. Then Captain Daniel Morris approached carrying the old notebook. He handed it to Harold without a word. Harold opened it slowly. Every page remained exactly as he had written it, until the last. The blank page was no longer empty. Hundreds of signatures filled it. Children, parents, teachers, former students, neighbors. Around the signatures, people had written short promises instead of compliments. "I'll learn every student's name. I'll notice the quiet child. I'll walk someone home. I'll keep showing up." Harold read each line in complete silence. When he finally looked up, tears rested openly in his eyes. "I asked Lucas not to fill this page too quickly." I smiled gently. "I didn't." He looked around at the people surrounding him. "You all did." For several moments, no one spoke. Then Harold slowly closed the notebook and rested both hands upon it. "There is one story I've never told." The crowd became perfectly still. "I've spent 40 years believing people remembered me because I stood in the street with a stop sign." He shook his head softly. "I was wrong." He looked toward the children crossing safely behind the volunteers. "They remembered because every morning I remembered them first." His voice weakened, but his words remained clear. "Michael's mother once asked me to help every child get home." He smiled through quiet tears. "Looking at all of you, I think we finally have." No one applauded. No one rushed toward the stage. Parents simply reached for their children's hands. Volunteers returned to their places along the sidewalk. The crosswalk became busy once more. Not because Harold stood there alone, but because the quiet promise he had carried for 40 years no longer belonged to only one man. As I watched him sitting peacefully beneath the old maple tree overlooking the intersection, I realized the greatest recognition he could ever receive had never been a statue, a speech, or a newspaper headline. It was seeing others continue the work without needing his instructions. For the first time since the day Harold disappeared from the crosswalk, the fear of losing his legacy quietly disappeared with it. A year has passed since the morning Harold Bennett stood beneath the old maple tree and watched an entire community carry forward the promise he had guarded for 4 decades. The crosswalk outside Jefferson Elementary still grows busy before every school day begins, but something has changed in a way that no traffic count or school report could ever measure. Every volunteer now begins the morning the same way Harold always did. Not by raising a stop sign, by greeting each child by name. The new volunteer program expanded beyond Jefferson Elementary within months. Neighboring schools asked how they could participate. Retired neighbors, veterans, grandparents, and former teachers stepped forward, not because they wanted recognition, but because they had discovered that the smallest acts of faithful service often become the strongest foundation of a community. Harold never returned to the crosswalk. His doctors insisted his heart could no longer endure the physical demands, and this time he accepted their decision with quiet grace. Instead, he visited the school twice each semester. He sat beneath the maple tree where children eagerly hurried over to tell him about spelling tests, soccer games, piano recitals, and dreams for the future. He still remembered every name. More remarkably, he remembered every promise they had made to become kind, honest, and brave. One autumn afternoon, I carried the old notebook back to him. The leather had become softer with age, but the final page remained exactly as we had completed it together. Hundreds of signatures. Hundreds of promises. No empty space remained. "I think it's finished," I said. Harold smiled and gently shook his head. "No." He turned to the inside cover and wrote one final sentence beneath the words, "Names matter more than medals." When people remember one another, no page is ever truly finished. He closed the notebook and handed it back to me. "It belongs to the school now. Today, it rests inside a glass display case near the entrance of Jefferson Elementary. Children often stop to read a few of the handwritten promises before class begins. Teachers tell me they occasionally watch students quietly add a new act of kindness to their own journals after seeing Harold's notebook. The legacy was never about preserving an old book. It was about preserving a way of seeing people. Whenever I walk past the crosswalk before school, I still catch myself expecting to hear Harold's familiar voice calling each child by name. Then I realize I do hear it, not from one man, but from dozens of volunteers who chose to continue his quiet work without expecting thanks. If this story reminded you that the smallest daily acts of kindness can shape lives far beyond what we ever see, carry that lesson into someone else's tomorrow. Learn a name. Notice the quiet child. Offer a patient word. Those simple choices may become the story another generation remembers long after we are gone. May your life always leave room for someone to feel seen. Your kindness outlast your years, and your quiet acts of honor continue finding their way home in the hearts of others.